Yes. Malcolm X, he lived from May 19th to 1925 to February 21st, 1965. He was a minister, a human rights activist, and prominent Black nationalist leader who served as a spokesman for the Nation of Islam during 1950s and 1960s. Did he like denounce Islam at one point? I won't say anything. Okay.
He'll talk about that.
Due largely to his efforts, the Nation of Islam grew from a mere 400 members at the time he was released from prison in 1952 to 40,000 members by 1960. So I have hope for this club. Articulate, passionate, and a naturally gifted and inspirational orator, Malcolm X exhorted Blacks to cast off the shackles of racism by any means necessary, including violence. The fiery civil rights leader broke with the group shortly after his assassination on February 21st, 1965, at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan, where he had been preparing to deliver a speech. Ladies and gentlemen, Malcolm X.
Thank you everyone for having me here today. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank my lovely wife Betty for letting me to be here as well. We have 4 beautiful daughters at home. We actually have 2 on the way, so anytime she lets me out of the house, I'm really appreciative of that fact. So I want to thank her for letting me be here as well. Just to get started, I want to just tell you that the topic of this presentation is really going to be about transformation. Many of you are probably familiar with me, and you probably have various views of my history or my background and various opinions. But you also may know that I have gone through various transformations in my life, which have allowed me to make it here today and speak to you folks about where I'm currently at in my life. But a couple things I want to, at the beginning here, stress about me that I think have been missed, that have been around there for a very long time. The first one being that I am pro-violence. I am not pro-violence, have never been pro-violence. In fact, my view has been that I just believe that African Americans, like all folks, have the right to defend themselves when they are attacked. The second view is that I am somehow anti-white or racist. I am not anti-white or racist. In fact, at this point in my life, I am looking forward to encouragement, working further with other groups of people that will help us in our cause to get to where we'd like to go. But I thought it'd be instructive, since we're talking about transformation here, for me to talk about where I came from and how I arrived at the place I am today in my life. As Evelyn said, I was born in 1925, May 19th. I was born in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, my parents, you may not know this, my mom was actually from Grenada. She was half white. She was very light-skinned, and in fact, she actually passed for white on several occasions, which many people didn't know. But she had a very interesting relationship with her skin color. On one level, she actually hated it to a certain extent. It allowed her to get a lot of work, but at the same time, whenever someone discovered that she had Black children, like when I was a very young child at one point, I actually made the mistake of showing up at one of her places of work, and she was promptly fired because of that. So that was always an issue for her. My dad was a Black man from Georgia, and both of my parents were heavily involved in something called the UNIA, and this was very informative to my life. And if you're not familiar with the UNIA, that was called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Now, those of you that have studied history, you probably are aware of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, his whole viewpoint was that African Americans, their only hope and only opportunity for equality and freedom was to actually move back to Africa. This was a movement that was pretty prevalent throughout the mid-20s, and something that eventually ended in him going to prison for tax evasion a little bit later on. But my dad was a very pronounced speaker on this cause. He spent a great ton of time speaking on this. My mom actually operated as the secretary for my dad and worked in this organization as well. And as you can imagine, this didn't make our family very popular in the various places we were. In fact, when my mom was pregnant with me, a story that she told me is that the Ku Klux Klan actually came to our house and actually asked for my father. He was not home, and they noticed that she was pregnant, and they proceeded to threaten her, and eventually they rode away. But clearly, that was something that had a big impact on her and a big impact on me as a child growing up. I also did have several siblings. I had 6 brothers and sisters who I was very close to. My dad actually was married prior to meeting my mother, so I had several older siblings that were pretty instrumental in my life as well. But eventually we did leave Omaha. We made the decision to move. We spent some time in Milwaukee when I was growing up in the Midwest. Now, one of the things that folks may think is because we were in the Midwest. I think there's a common perception that when you're in the North and you're not in the South, that things are very different. But one of the things I made and pointed out to people several times is that in that time in the United States, up until even this time to a certain extent, the South was everything south of Canada. And I like to make that very clear. Because there's a perception that because we were in the Midwest, things may have been a little bit different. So we did ultimately end up moving to East Lansing, Michigan, and that's where I spent a lot of my childhood. So growing up in East Lansing was very interesting. My father actually did build us a house. My father continued to preach on the Marcus Garvey philosophy, as well as did my mother, but we also became pretty unpopular there as well. I was woken up, one of my earliest memories as a child was to be woken up when I was about 4 years old to our house being on fire. And that's because they had set our house on fire and burnt it down because of the fact that my dad was preaching the works of Marcus Garvey. We were forced to move out, and my father ended up building a totally another house, which was a pretty big deal for us as a family. So we did end up moving to another place in East Lansing. And at that time, my father was preaching and preaching and preaching, and there was another organization that was kind of an offshoot of the Ku Klux Klan. It was called the Black Legion. My father was actually murdered by the Black Legion when I was a young child. Now, the interesting thing about this story, and something that had a pretty significant impact on me growing up, is that my father had taken out 2 life insurance policies. One life insurance policy was actually paid out. The second one was not paid out. And it was because my father allegedly committed suicide. Now, I don't know about you, but it's very difficult for someone to bash the back of their own head in and fall on the trolley tracks and die. We were denied that other insurance policy, which forced my mom to work more and more and more. It's put a lot of stress on her with having a family as big as ours. I will just be honest in that I did not help out as much. Me and my brothers actually spent a lot of time running the streets, and we would even sometimes take money from the family. But it put a lot of stress on my mom, and at some point she started to lose it. While this was going on, simultaneously, the social services was spending a lot of time coming into our home, and ultimately they were to a certain extent trying to divide us a little bit. Now, the social service system, and this may give you some ideas onto how my views developed on white folks as I grew up, was actually run by some white folks. And we had a white social worker that kept coming to the house over and over again, questioning us about our mom, questioning us about our environment, and then ultimately resulted in us all being broken apart and ended up in foster care. Our family was split apart except for my 2 older siblings who were fortunate enough to stay in the house. I actually was sent to a white family's home. It was kind of a detention center in a mostly white area of Michigan. And actually I was treated relatively fairly in this environment. There were only 2 other black kids in the home with me. Though an interesting observation I will always make, and one of my experiences as a black child, was that when you were black at that time period, you were somewhat treated as kind of a mascot of it, and that's how I was treated as such in that home. They would have conversations as if I wasn't there at times. They would refer to me by the word that I will not speak today, the N-word. They would refer to me that way quite a bit. And I got used to hearing that word so much that I really, honestly, at a certain point didn't take it very personally, which is strange to think now. However, I was very popular in school growing up. I actually even became class president when I was in junior high. So the kids liked me. And in fact, a lot of my friends, most of my friends at this time, were fellow white students. I even had involvement with a couple of the white female students, which was a little bit on the down low, because at that time, as you can imagine, that was not something that you talked about a lot back then. Now, another formative part of my life, something that really impacted me greatly. I knew that I had ability to speak. I knew I was a smart young child. I felt that growing up. But at one point, one of my English teachers did actually ask me what I wanted to do for a living. He said, "Malcolm, what do you want to pursue? What is your goal? What do you want to do?" And at the time, I was in 8th grade. I didn't know what I wanted to do. Who really knows what they want to do in 8th grade? But I thought to myself, okay, I was class president. I'm great at speaking. I think I want to be a lawyer. And what he told me was, that's not realistic for you. that is not something that you should do. It was suggested to me that I should become a carpenter or do something that is acceptable for a person of my race. And once I heard that, it had a major life impact and change on me. That changed everything. That changed my whole viewpoint. It made me think that there really wasn't an opportunity for me, and I figured that I had to make it on my own and find a way to make it. So from there, I ended up moving to Boston, where I spent some time with my older sister, Ella, who primarily raised me. And quite frankly, I started running the streets, doing all kinds of things with my friends, finding all kinds of hustles to make money. I worked on the trade. Now, one of the interesting things you may not know is that I actually worked in a dance club in Boston as a shoe shine boy for several years. And during that time, that was massively influential. If you can imagine, all the jazz greats were coming in at that time. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Lionel Hampton. I actually had the privilege of being in the presence of Billie Holiday. Wow. There were tons of great people coming in. It was a really great place to be. I also started doing a lot of hustling in that particular place as well. And that's where I kind of learned to hustle. From there, I worked on the trains as well, and I even did some dishwashing. And one other future celebrity that you all may know that I actually ended up working with quite a bit was a gentleman by the name of Red Fox. When we were working together, we actually became pretty great friends. I was referred to as Detroit Red because I was from Detroit area. He was referred to as Chicago Red, and that's how we got to know each other at that time. So I spent a lot of time doing that. But as I was trying to find my way to figure out who I am and just to try to figure out what I wanted to do, I got involved in crime. And I started to do a lot of different crimes. And at that time, I actually did have a white girlfriend. Her name was Sophia, and my best friend Shorty was dating her sister. And so we decided at that time, well, hey, how can we make some money? Well, what we thought to ourselves at that time was, well, perhaps we could start doing some burglary. And that was a mistake, and that's something we started doing. We started burglarizing houses in the Boston area. And we actually started getting quite good at it. And one of the things that I did in my foolishness, which was probably one of the dumbest things I did, is I had the audacity when I think back now, to actually decide that I was going to get one of the watches that I found that was broken fixed by a jeweler. Now, as a young man, that probably wasn't the best move, but I thought I was invincible. I thought I could do whatever I want. But in retrospect, that was probably the best thing that I could have ever done. Because when I showed up to pick up that watch, guess what happened? The police stepped out from behind the curtain and they arrested me. And at the time, I just put my hands up, because if I didn't put my hands up, I was dead. And that was one of the best things that could have happened to me. So we went to trial for this crime. Everybody was given up, including my friend Shorty, the two women that we were actually involved with. And an interesting thing happened. Now, normally for a crime like this at my age, I would have probably gotten maybe 1 or 2 years. But my crime wasn't the robbery. My crime wasn't the robbery. I'm sure people know what the crime really was. The crime was being with a white woman. In fact, my public defender sitting next to me actually asked me, why were you with a white woman? That was his number one concern. That was the main crime. So the two white accomplices, the two women we were with, they ended up getting about 2 years. I believe they served 7 months. Me and Shorty ended up getting 10 years each for our crime. So we ended up going to jail for 10 years. Not quite that, but that's what we ended up getting for our sentences. And so obviously that had a big influence on my views and how I viewed our treatment by white folks in society. But again, prison, as you probably heard before, was one of the biggest life-altering things for me. It was one of the best things that happened to me. Now, when I first got to jail, I knew everything. I was the man. I was not listening to anybody. In fact, when I was in prison, they even called me Satan, because I did not want to hear about religion. I did not want to hear about one thing. Until I met a man in prison named Bembry. Now, Bembry was one of the most eloquent men you could have known. I mean, everybody listened to him. He spoke, and people listened. And the reason they listened is because he was well-read. He read everything. Even the guards let him talk. And it occurred to me, maybe if I wanted to get some things going on, maybe if I wanted to get some more people listen to me and maybe make some inways, that maybe I should start to read. Maybe I should start to learn. And so at that point, I started reading and started educating myself. Because in jail, as you can imagine, you have a heck of a lot of time to educate yourself. And so that's what I spent time doing. Now, around that same time, my family, one of my brothers, had actually started converting to this thing called Islam. He actually had joined something called the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam was actually different than traditional Islam. The Nation of Islam was actually founded by a black man. And the leader's name, his name was the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Now, there were some different tenets of this particular version of Islam that some of you may be familiar with, and some of you may have even heard me talk about. One of those tenets was that the black man is the original man. The second sentiment which you probably have heard, which I promise not to call any of you today, was that all white people are devils. And the final thought in that whole religion was that the white man's time is limited. Those were the three things. Now, when I first heard this, I thought to myself, this is crazy. I mean, I've known white people my whole life. I had a white girlfriend, I had these, but then when I thought back to myself, all the experiences that I had had up until that time had really kind of jived with what my brother was telling me. So he had told me initially, hey, here's what you gotta do to join. You gotta stop eating pork and you can't smoke. Now, when he first told me this, in my hustler's mind, I actually thought, hey, this must be a way to actually get out of prison early. If I stop smoking and stop eating pork, that's gonna do something. But that wasn't the case. That was one of the things you were supposed to do. But as I started learning more about this religion, I started seeing how it was applicable to my life, and it gave me a sense of discipline. And I actually started writing to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and he actually took the time to write back to me. And that had a big impression on me, that this man, this powerful man, would write back to me and give me his time and his energy. In fact, he even sent me $5 in one of the letters that he sent back to me. And I started taking this discipline in prison, and I started focusing on educating myself. I actually read the whole dictionary. I started reading every single philosopher, every single book I could get my hand on. And education became my key. And eventually when I was released from prison, when that happened, I ended up going and working for the Nation of Islam. And it was one of the best things I could have ever done. It gave me the opportunity to go out and speak to young black men, to empower them, and that was my goal, to empower black people. That is what I wanted them to do, to have power and to see that they could do it on their own. And for a time, my view was that there should be separation between the races. In fact, that's one of the main things I was preaching. I was preaching that we should either go back to Africa, or if we can't do that, we should just have a separate place in the United States. In fact, one thing you may not know is that the Elijah Muhammad, at one point, this is a little known fact, I actually had a meeting with the Ku Klux Klan at one point in Georgia. And part of that meeting was they actually reached out to Elijah Muhammad, and the reason they reached out to him was because they said, hey, we're all on the same page. You want segregation, we want segregation. And so we actually had a dialogue going. And one of the interesting things that the Ku Klux Klan actually asked me about during our meeting, and this is fascinating, something you may not know, they actually asked me, how close are you to Martin Luther King? They actually asked me that in that meeting. They actually asked me, do you have ability to get his schedule to tell us where he is? That actually happened. Now, I went into that meeting with my instructions to come up with some kind of negotiation, and the ultimate goal of that meeting was actually to secure a place of land in Georgia where the Honorable Elijah Muhammad could start setting up a black colony at one point. That was actually something that he was looking at doing. And the interesting thing about that is after that meeting, one of the main Klan leaders in Georgia at that time, at one of the meetings, he actually brought this up, but people didn't know what he was talking about. He actually suggested that maybe at some point Atlanta could be looked at as the place where all black people can go to. So that's a little known fact that actually happened. So that's a very interesting fact. But as I got further into the Nation of Islam, I started to be disillusioned a little bit. Some of the things I became disillusioned about was the fact that we were getting questions about why were we not taking action. We, of course, were always willing to protect other members of the Nation of Islam. When violence happened, we were always able to protect our own members. But there were other civil rights obviously movements happening at the same time with Martin Luther King. And we were getting questions about why weren't we there. And I started talking to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, proposing that maybe we should start taking some actions. Maybe we should start being there. And that was not something that he was interested in hearing, and that started making me have some different thoughts about that. The other thing which you may have heard about, which also started to change my whole view and my whole role in the organization, was I made a very famous quote when President Kennedy died. And I was asked about that, and I was told, we were all told the Nation of Islam at that time to not speak about the assassination. But when I was asked about it, I was constantly being questioned. I was constantly being asked for interviews. I just said that's just a case of the chickens coming home to roost. Now, a lot of people took offense at that statement. That statement was not to be a denigration of President Kennedy. It was just a statement of the fact that there was tons of violence going on in that time, and that violence that was happening was bound to come back to him and bound to come back to him and manifest in some other form. But that got me in a lot of trouble, and it actually got me silenced for 90 days in the Nation of Islam. But the final thing that really made me think that it was time to separate from the Nation of Islam was that I started hearing murmurs and words that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad may have fathered some children by female members of the organization. Young members, some teens. This was a major concern to me. When I confronted him about it, he tried to justify it, and then his son verified it for me. And at the same time, there was also a lot of jealousy happening towards me. A lot of members were viewing me as holding myself out to be the leader of the Nation of Islam, which I never did. In fact, I actually turned down several interviews repeatedly, and even when reporters would call me and ask about me and try to categorize me as the leader of the Nation of Islam, I would ask them specifically not to say I was the leader of the Nation of Islam. But it was not being perceived that way. And eventually the decision was made to make a split from the Nation of Islam, and that's what I did. Now, when that happened, I initially didn't start transitioning my views. I had a lot of the same views, but I also realized that maybe we needed to be more open-minded in who we work with and the things we do. But the most transformative thing that I did during that time and after that time was take a trip to Mecca to do the Hajj to Mecca. And that experience was an experience that completely altered my view of race and people. Because the thing that I found when I was in Mecca was that there were all kinds of Muslims. I was sitting next to Muslims and breaking bread and talking to Muslims that had blonde hair and blue eyes. There was every race and creed there. And it started occurring to me that maybe we could all work together, or at least try to make some inroads. It occurred to me that all white people are not bad and that we can do some things. I also made several other trips to the Middle East. I made a trip to Egypt as well. I spent quite a bit of time there. I also formed another organization that was a secular organization that was not part of Islam. It was called the Organization of African American Unity. And that was designed to really spread the word about Pan-Africanism. I actually have many times tried to meet with the leaders of African nations. One thing you may not have known about me is that I actually tried relentlessly to get the United Nations to file a human rights violation suit against the United States because of the plight of black people in this country. I tried to get many African nations to get on board with that, but they weren't willing to do that. So that's one of the things I did. I also founded the Muslim Mosque, Inc., which was my separate mosque in Harlem, New York, which is where I'm spending a lot of my time now. Now, one of the things I will say here is that I've always felt that I would probably die by violence. That's something that I've always said. Currently at this time, I think that's very possible. I know the Nation of Islam is not very happy with me. I know there's a possibility that could happen. But whether that happens or not, I feel that I have made some inroads and I've made some changes and I've made some progress. And I'm looking forward to working with anyone, any groups, regardless of race, no matter their views, as long as they view the empowerment of black people as one of their number one goals. And that's where I'm at, and that's my transformation. But I wanted to ask, do I have any questions or comments?
That's fantastic.
Yes.
Did they ever determine who it was that killed all this?
So go out of character. Actually, they recently exonerated 2 of the guys that were accused of killing him. There was no evidence. There was one guy that was convicted of it, who actually did admit to doing it. But the other 2 men they actually did arrest. The man that they actually did convict, he flat out said from the beginning that the 2 men they arrested with him were not his accomplices. So one guy they know for sure did it, but the other 2 people they're not really sure about. An interesting thing I was just sharing with Jan before this is that, we were talking about Jan brought up Louis Farrakhan, and who's obviously, still a pretty controversial gentleman, is that he actually pretty much admitted that the Nation of Islam did orchestrate the killing of Malcolm X. I mean, in one speech, he actually outright said it. The other thing that I didn't really bring up here just because it's me talking as Malcolm X, but Malcolm X was under surveillance from the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover from day one. I think the main trigger, which was interesting, is that he wrote a lot of letters to, when he converted to Islam, he wrote letters to everybody, including President Truman. so he was on the radar immediately, and what's fascinating is that there's some rumors that certain members of law enforcement actually knew that he was going to be assassinated before he was. They just let it happen. One of the men that was Malcolm X's bodyguards, in fact, was an undercover NYPD officer. Now, he was there, and his story is really fascinating. He was there, and he actually would have tried to stop it. He didn't know what was going to happen either. But what he made the observation about it is he said afterwards, when he did call it in, he said it took an extremely long time for the cops to get there. I mean, they just took forever to get there. So it's, I think the way I look at it is that it's clear that probably certain elements of law enforcement knew that Malcolm X, but he knew. I mean, he was smart, he knew it. But I think that ultimately the Nation of Islam was the nation. They did make the choice to have him taken out. I think that's pretty certain.